Let's say you're a heavy user of Azure DevOps, and specifically Azure Pipelines. However, you're starting to look into how do you transition to using GitHub as well. Well, in this video, we're going to look at how Azure Pipelines and GitHub are better together. Hey y'all, I'm Mickey Gousset, and today we're talking about Azure Pipelines and GitHub, better together. Today we're going to cover how to configure the GitHub app to allow Azure Pipelines and GitHub to talk to each other, what happens behind the scenes on both Azure Pipelines and GitHub once that app is configured, some gotchas to be aware of, and some best practices. Let's get started. All right, so let's show you how to configure the integration between Azure Pipelines and GitHub and a couple of ins and outs and gotchas to be aware of. Now I'm starting off with a brand new GitHub repository called Graceland. And if I go into settings in that repository, then we'll see under integrations, I have no GitHub apps currently installed. So I've not integrated this repository with anything. On the Azure DevOps side, I've also created a team project called Graceland. I just happen to name them the same thing. And if we look at project settings and we look under service connections for pipelines, then we'll see that we don't have a service connection right now. So we have no connection between GitHub and Azure Pipelines. Now, I could click Create Service Connection, and I could say I want to create a connection to GitHub. And if I do it this way, then I either have to use OAuth or a personal access token. Either of those options would tie the connection directly to me. And that's not what we want to do. Because if I win the lottery and quit and my personal access token or my account gets deactivated, then the connection would quit working. Now you could use a service account to do this, but another option is to use what's called a GitHub app. And you can use this app to create the connection between GitHub and Azure Pipelines without having to tie it to a specific, say, service account or person. So let's cancel out of this. And to use the GitHub app, the first step is to go to the GitHub Marketplace. And let's do a search for Azure Pipelines. And we can see here's our Azure Pipelines app. And we can just kind of step through the process. The first step is we need to set up a plan. So we'll click Set up a plan. In this case, I want to pick the account where I want to install the app. And in this, I want it to be my Mickey Gousset org. So I'm installing it in my organization there as opposed to tying it to a particular user account. So I'm going to install it in my org. Again, it's free, get 10 parallel jobs, that all looks great. So I'm going to say complete the order and begin installation. Now, this takes me here where I have to say, okay, GitHub app, what do you want to have access to? And I can say in this organization that this app has access to all repositories, or I can say it only has access to select repositories. And which one of those you pick is really going to depend on what your, requirements are. So I'm going to say only select repositories, and I'm going to select my Graceland repository that we created earlier. And I'm going to click Install. This configures some stuff on the GitHub side, then takes me back to Azure DevOps to configure some things on the Azure DevOps side. So I'll select the appropriate account. And now, because I have selected a repository, it's asking me which team project do I want to tie that repository to. The idea being, obviously I need to know which repository can access a team project so that I can know what pipelines can be used or what repos those pipelines can target. So we're going to say, let's go pick my Mickey Goose org in Azure DevOps, and we're going to pick the Graceland team project in Azure DevOps, and we'll click continue. Now we're going to get prompted to authorize this to happen. So we're going to authorize it. And at this point, it's going to walk us through creating our first pipeline that ties back into GitHub. So we'll select the Graceland repository in GitHub. We'll go with just a starter pipeline. And we're going to change the name of the pipeline to be Starter Pipeline 1. This is going to trigger anytime we do a push to main. It's going to run on Linux and basically just writes out some hello world stuff, which is fine. And we're going to say save it and run it. Now you'll notice we're committing directly to the main branch. And then we're going to go and look and see what happened with Azure Pipelines setting this stuff up for us. If we go back over to our team project, not our team project, if we go back over to our repository in GitHub, you'll see that we now have a starter pipeline 1 YAML file that was added 17 seconds ago. And if we go to settings in that project, or in that repo, and go to integrations, you can see that Azure Pipelines app has now been installed. Now I have a configure button here because I am also an org owner in GitHub, but if I was just a repo admin, I would not have this configure button because remember the apps are installed at the org level and then given access to repositories. But if I click configure, this takes me to the installed app where I can see the permissions that have been given to it. I could add other repositories, which we'll do in just a moment, or I could even remove the app. Now, one thing to keep in mind that in addition to what you can see here under installed GitHub apps, just uninstalling the app right here doesn't completely get rid of it. What you have to do also is under billing and plans, you'll see there is an Azure Pipelines section under billing and plans. You would also want to edit and remove it here as well. Removing it in both places makes it where in the future you can easily add the app back if you needed to add the application back. Now, over in the Graceland team project in Azure DevOps, if we go to project settings and we go to service connections, then you'll see that we have created a service connection called Mickey Goose org connecting, and this is the connection that connects to the GitHub app that allows the GitHub app to talk to the repo and talk back to Azure Pipelines. You can't modify this here, really, you can't change it, but it's there, and we can use that to create pipelines in the future. So you'll notice that our pipeline ran and it completed successfully, as you would expect. So if we want to actually trigger this ourselves with a change, we can do that. So let's go back over to GitHub and let's go to our repository, Graceland. And I'm just going to modify the README file, and I'm going to add a line triggering a pipeline. And we'll give this a commit message triggering a pipeline. Again, I'm going to commit directly to main right now. That's what my trigger is waiting on. And I'm going to commit that change. If we come back over to pipelines, and we can see that the triggering the pipeline commit has triggered this pipeline to run, and it's going to execute the pipeline in Azure Pipelines. And of course, I can be listening for pushes, I can be listening for pull requests, any of the triggers that we're using in Azure Pipelines, I can be listening for those and will run as appropriate. So we've walked through the basics of, oh, we've got a repo, we need to add it to a team project. But what if we then have another repo? So we create a second repo that we also want to add to this particular team project. Well, we can do that. So if we come back over to GitHub, and we will create a new repo, and we'll call this the Graceland API. I am a second repo to have Azure DevOps integrations. And we'll give it a README, and we'll give it a git ignore. And I always like to give it the Visual Studio git ignore because I usually do stuff in VS Code. And I can see I can automatically grant it access to the marketplace, to the app, but I'm not going to do that right now. I'm just going to say create repository. And so now I have a second repository. And what I want to do is add this repository, and I want this repository to point to the same Graceland project that the other repository points to. So to do that, I go back to the org level, go to settings, go to installed GitHub apps, click configure. I can say select repository, and I'm going to select my Graceland API repository, and I'm going to click save. This is then going to take me to Azure Pipelines, or to Azure DevOps, where once again I can select the organization and the team project that I want to tie this repo to. So I'm going to tie it back to the Graceland repository, or the Graceland team project, and I'll click continue. And like before, it's going to try to walk me through creating a new pipeline. Now I'm not going to do that in this case, but if you'll remember, if we go back to pipelines and we edit this pipeline, this particular pipeline's, if you remember when we created it to point at just the Graceland repository. So now let's create another pipeline that's pointing at the Graceland API repository. So if I go to pipelines and I say new pipeline, I'm going to select GitHub as where my code's going to be. And it's going to prompt me for this initial authorization. You'll notice that we're already authorized for mgusay.org. So we'll say authorize. And what it's going to try to do when I did that authorization, it's basically saying it's authorizing as me. So right now it's showing all the repositories that I might have access to, or that I own. But the point is, I don't want to connect as me to these repositories. I want to connect using that service account. So I can do that by saying specify a specific connection. This allows me to use the mguse org service account or service connection that we created previously. And then you can see, I can see the API and the Graceland repos, and I can select the Graceland API repo. I'll create a starter pipeline there, and we'll just save this. And if we go back to github.com/mickeygousset.org and we go to the Graceland API, you'll see that Azure Pipelines is there. The YAML file, we can edit the README file, and we could add in, let's trigger a pipeline as a comment in the README file. And we'll call the commit message, let's trigger a pipeline. And I'm going to commit those changes directly to the main branch. And now if we go back to pipelines, we can see that the API pipeline has kicked off. So what we've done at this point is we have connected two repositories to the same team project. Now, you're probably going to ask yourself, well, what if I have multiple team projects that I need to connect repositories to? Well, if you'll remember, the repositories are added on the GitHub side. So you can continue to add repositories on the GitHub side. And remember, when we added the repository, it prompted you then for the team project you wanted to connect to at that point. So let's go see what happens when we create a new team project and then we go and add a third repository. The question to ask yourself is, will only that repository be connected to the second team project? Or will both team projects at that point have access to all the repositories that the app has access to? Let's find out. So we'll go back up here to org, and we will create a new team project, and we'll call this the Graceland CLI team project. And we will create this team project. Now remember, the service connection to the app is defined at the team project level. So if we go to the project settings for Graceland CLI, then we'll notice that there is no current service connection. No problem. Let's go back over to the organization and let's create one more repository, and we'll call this the Graceland CLI. I am a repo used with Azure DevOps integrations. We'll add a README file, we'll add a git ignore. And we will say create repository. So now we want to add this repository to the GitHub app so that we can access it in a pipeline from the Graceland CLI team project that is in Azure DevOps. So if we go back to the organization level and we go to settings and we go to installed GitHub apps and we configure the Azure Pipeline app, then we can then select our Graceland CLI and click Save. This takes us back to Azure DevOps, where we can now pick our org and the Graceland CLI team project. Click Continue. But look, we have access to all of the repositories that GitHub app has access to. Is this a problem? Well, it depends. It depends on how your organization works. For example, let's say the GitHub CLI or the Graceland CLI repo only needs to be accessed from pipelines running in the Graceland CLI team project. That's not happening at this point because, as you can see, I have access to all 3 repos from this particular team project. And if I go back to just our standard Graceland team project and I go to pipelines and I create a new pipeline, and I say use the service connection, you can see that I have access to that Graceland CLI repo. So one of the caveats of using this Azure Pipelines integration is that you install the app, you give the app access to certain repositories, and you also give that app access to certain team projects. At that point, any team project that has access to the GitHub app has access to all the repositories in that app. If that's not going to work for you, if you need to have certain team projects that will only have access to certain repositories and you have to keep that separate from everybody else, then you would either have to have, back over in GitHub, you would either have to have multiple organizations in GitHub. And then in each organization, you can install the GitHub app and give it access. But that can also lead to other, not necessarily issues, but things to consider in that organization sprawl can also be difficult to manage long term if you have a lot of organizations. So that's one option you have. Another option you have is to not use the GitHub app and instead create that service connection using a personal access token or OAuth. And in that instance, what you probably would want to do is have a user in your GitHub that is a service account user that you could create personal access tokens from and use those to create the connections back. But if you don't require that separation, then the GitHub app is the best way to go to connect your Azure pipelines to your GitHub repositories. Oh, and one final tip. What if I want to add another team project to the GitHub app, but I don't want to add any more repos to the GitHub app? Well, if we come back over to our Graceland team project and we go to project settings and we go to service connections, then as we saw earlier, there's not really any editing we can do here. So what you have to do is go back over to the organization, go to settings, go to installed apps, and go to configure the Azure Pipelines app. And what we really need to do is just be able to click the save button so that it would then take us to the Azure DevOps side where we could select another team project to create a connection to. But we can't do that because we haven't modified anything. So what you do is click all repositories, then click only select repositories. You'll notice it kept what was previously selected, but now my save button is enabled. And if I click save, it takes me back over to Azure Pipelines or Azure DevOps, and I now have the ability to come down and select a team project that I might want to connect to. So that's just a quick little tip on how to add more team projects in without having to change the repositories that you are wanting to link those team projects to. So there you have it, Azure Pipelines and GitHub better together and how to integrate them. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If so, please like the video, subscribe to my channel, and smash that bell so that you're notified of any updates. Thanks for watching.